Thanks very much for staying with us. Time now for Eye on Africa with me, Georgia Calvin-Smith. Tonight, after South Africa becomes the first country on the continent to record 1 million coronavirus cases, new restrictions are announced, including the unpopular ban on alcohol sales and mandatory mask wearing in public. Also, Central African Republic's Electoral Commission says that 800 polling stations didn't open during the country's presidential election on Sunday because of rebel attacks. We take a closer look at the follow-up with our correspondent in the country. And during World War II, European countries relied heavily on black men who were sometimes enrolled by force from the colonies. At the time, there was little recognition of their efforts. Now, the Commonwealth War Graves Commission has finally begun a process of commemoration. But first, a day after South Africa became the first country on the continent to record 1 million coronavirus cases, President Cyril Ramaphosa announced new restrictions aimed at tackling the rapid rise in infections. That's been, in part, driven by a new strain of the virus that's believed to be more contagious. The new requirements include some familiar old measures, including a ban on sales of alcohol. Mask wearing has also been made mandatory in public, and the evening curfew has been moved to 9 p.m, whereas previously it had been at 11. Ramaphosa said that efforts had to be ramped up ahead of 2021.
The new year is upon us. Our children will soon be going back to school. Places of learning will soon reopen so that they can resume their studies. We will want to get back to work, to earning, and to looking for work. We want our life to resume. We all have plans and hopes and dreams for 2021.
Well, Jane Flanagan joins me now with more. Jane, so do you think that these measures that have been brought in are striking the right balance between taking stress off hospitals whilst giving the economy room to breathe? We heard Ramaphosa there saying that the country is keen to try and return to normal in 2021.
Yes, George, I think the president is trying to strike a balance, a very delicate balance between keeping the economy going, but at the same time addressing what's happening in the hospitals, which are absolutely fit to bursting. And one of the reasons why the hospitals are coming under strain is because of the abuse of alcohol. South Africans do have this relationship with alcohol, which means that we just end up with all these car crashes, fights, crime, and so on, which puts more and more strain on the hospitals. So banning alcohol sales is a tool that the government does like to introduce. The hard lockdown that we saw in March absolutely hollowed out jobs and flattened businesses. And Cyril Ramaphosa came under a lot of criticism for going for such a hard and early lockdown. And on this occasion, he's trying to balance the books between the economy and the hospitals. And we'll have to wait and see whether he's done enough to meet both objectives.
Now, with some of these restrictions on movement coming in very, very quickly, how is all of this going to affect South Africans, bearing in mind that the country is in the middle of its holiday season?
Well, the devil's in the detail. We're going to have more explanation tomorrow morning about what this means in terms of travel around the country between provinces and so on. The week before, between Christmas and New Year, this is the equivalent in France of high season in August. Almost nobody's at home. People are visiting family, people are at their second homes or their rented accommodation or hotels. So an absolute ban on going to the beaches, being in outside spaces. What's going to happen to people who have got plans, who half the family are somewhere, they've made bookings. It's absolutely going to, again, really clobber the beleaguered travel industry in this country at a time when it was really trying to claw back some of the lost bed nights and revenue that it's lost this year. So we'll have to see how it's all going to unravel. But the children are at home for another month. In your clip there, he's talking about the schools resuming. It's hard to see how the schools can reopen in a month's time, given the state of high rate of infections we're seeing at the moment.
With regard to that spike that we're seeing, is it all to do with the new coronavirus strain, which clearly must go some way to account for the spike in numbers, but how far has people's behaviour affected this?
Well, it's not only Christmas, but it's the end of the academic year, and there has been definitely a change in behavior. The hot weather, people were laboring under this assumption that being outside, the higher temperatures somehow gave them extra protection from coronavirus. And it does seem as though the scientists believe that the new strain that we're seeing in South Africa and strains in other parts of the world as well, whether that could be driving an increased rate of infections, or really is it behavior change? And what the scientists say is that actually it's the younger generation, the students, end of year parties and so on, that have really driven this spike in infections. But whether or not these new measures can rein in some of that behavior, we'll have to wait and see.
Thanks very much. Jane Flanagan there for us in Cape Town. A look at some other news. Burkina Faso's president was sworn in for a second term on Monday. Marc Kabore tackled the growing security threat faced by the country in his inauguration speech in Ouagadougou. At least 1,200 people have been killed in the country since jihadists extended their attacks from neighbouring Mali in 2015. And Central African Republic's Electoral Commission said that hundreds of polling stations, more than 14%, didn't open during the country's presidential and legislative elections on Sunday because of rebel attacks. More than 55,000 people have been displaced since fighting began earlier this month. Armed groups vowed to march on the capital after several candidates, including former President François Bozizé, were barred from running. Clément Di Roma tells us more.
The streets of Bangui are lively once again after being deserted yesterday, unlike the polling stations where thousands went to vote on Sunday. If voters showed a strong presence in the capital despite fears of attack by armed groups, not everybody was able to vote in other regions. Hundreds of polling stations are said to have remained closed in the center and northwest of the country following pressure from armed groups. Shots were heard in several districts even before polls were open, and once the vote was over, ballot boxes were reportedly stolen by armed groups and others were burned in several areas. Despite these events, the government and the UN are saying that their bet of holding the vote on Sunday, despite the security situation, paid off.
With these armed men, the population was not able to exercise its civic rights. But the plan to secure the elections worked. And if only 2 out of 16 prefectures were unable to properly vote, I'd call that a success.
The security situation remains tense in several regions and fighting is said to have resumed this Monday. The government and the UN, which had called in some extra 300 security forces, said they will continue to protect voters even after the vote. Vote counting is still underway in some polling stations and the process is long since the first provisional results will not be known before January 4th.
Clément Di Roma there for us. Look now at some news in brief. Sudan sending troop reinforcements to South Darfur state after 15 people were killed in tribal clashes there. Fighting between the Masalit and Falata tribes in the area has flared up around Gereda for the first time since a reconciliation meeting was held in October. The troop deployment comes less than a week after the UN Security Council agreed to Sudan's request that it end the UN and African Union's peacekeeping mission when their mandate expires at the end of this month. Ethiopian police have held a cameraman of the Reuters news agency without charge ever since he was arrested at his home in Addis last week. Kumera Gamechu had been reporting on the country's conflict in the Tigray region. Media access has been restricted and the area saw a total communications blackout for 6 weeks as fighting between federal and regional forces escalated. And France 24's Arabic correspondent in Mali, Ahmed Al-Khouri, passed away suddenly over the weekend. He also worked extensively with our colleagues on the French channel. He'd worked tirelessly with France 24 on difficult terrain since 2014. Now, during World War II, European countries relied heavily on black men who were sometimes enrolled by force from the colonies. At the time, there was no recognition of their efforts. Even whilst they risked their lives, they were often treated as inferior and segregated from white soldiers. Well, the Commonwealth War Graves Commission has recently begun a process of commemoration. Wasim Kone tells us more.
In the busy streets of Johannesburg, the home and the voice of a World War II veteran. Simon Malanga has had a long life, and he's still alive and kicking.
I'm about now 106.
106, according to Simon, even older, says his family, and Simon has seen a lot. He's one of the last surviving soldiers of the Native Military Corps, a black South African military unit.
Well, I went to the army because of my poverty. So then I left my parents, and then I went away. Now I didn't even tell them that I'm getting to the army.
Back then, though, black soldiers were forbidden from fighting, and they often worked as laborers, guards, and medical aides. Simon guarded prisoners of war in Italy, and while white soldiers were rewarded with new homes, black soldiers were given boots or bicycles.
I was given a bicycle. I had to accept it, but really I feel it's a cheating that I've been cheated by the government of South Africa to give me a bicycle.
The segregation continued even in death, with black servicemen buried away from white soldiers. Today, the Commonwealth War Graves Commission is working to honor those forgotten volunteers, but official records are hard to come by.
The documentation was very rudimentary, and not a lot of effort was put in. A lot of them are written in pencil, and over the intervening 100 years, they've faded.
Simon Malanga says the past is the past. When he returned from the war, he took up singing and dancing in marching bands, which he still enjoys 75 years later.
Shake the body, shake the body.
He's been through a lot, but he's still got it. But finally, a renowned South African sculptor's work has earned him an accolade for the highest artistic achievement in the history of solo exhibitions in the country. Pitika Ntuli is also a poet, and his latest project, Azubuyele Emasisweni, means the return to the source. The 75-year-old spent 3 years crafting 45 bone sculptures. Because of the pandemic, it's been presented virtually, but he is still hoping to take the exhibition on tour next year. So if you can catch it, try to. Well, that's it for Eye on Africa. Thanks for joining us. Do so again if you can. Take care.